Good morning to Scotland, good morning to Europe. Wherever you are, please welcome to the 6th International Academic Forum brought to you by ARIISW, the Asian Research Institute for International Social Work at Shukutoku University, Japan. My name is Joseph Gohori, the Chief Researcher at ARIISW Shukutoku, and I will be serving as your moderator today. Today we'll focus on international social work and globalization. Our topic is, what is the international social work with the globalized states or local? And now I would like to invite our main speaker, Dr. Lena Dominelli, professor at the University of Stirling, to deliver her keynote lecture. Professor Lena Dominelli holds a chair in social work and is director of the Disaster Interventions and Humanitarian Aid Program at the University of Stirling in Scotland. She is the author of Green Social Work and other books and studies related to global issues and international social work. Dear Professor Dominelli, thank you very much for joining us today. We are really happy to have you. And well, please welcome Professor Lena Dominelli. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. But before I start, I wanted to say thank you very much for inviting me to share this wonderful occasion with you. And I want to say hello, everybody. And I am so honored and privileged to be speaking to you, albeit via the wonders of technology. And I see many friends, and hopefully I've made some new ones, or will make some more new ones on the list of participants. And so I say an especial warm hello to you because I know you and we've worked together, and that includes Tatsuru, who's a great friend. We've had many discussions about international social work. But I also wanted to say thank you to both Professor Akimoto and Dr. Asano for their presentations, because they've really set the scene very well for me. In terms of the backdrop within which we're operating. And if there's only one thing that you remember about what I say today, I would like it to be that the questions, the very profound 4 questions that we've been asked to deal with today in our discussion are really fundamental to what we're doing. And the what we're doing is self-defined. I'm not going to define it for you. I can only define it for myself. But I want you to think that social work, whether we're working from the local basis of the local state or the local domestic situation, or what I prefer to call the local community, is embedded within a globalized world today. That is our historical context. And within that, I feel part of the contested nature of our knowledge, including our identity, like what is a social worker? Can I call myself a social worker? Is contested. And I can tell you that in the UK, this is across the 4 nations of the UK, because we're becoming more and more differentiated as we have more and more devolution to the nation states of Scotland, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. We have differing legislations, but the one thing we all have in common is that no one, absolutely no one, who may be doing what is called social work activities can call themselves a social worker unless they are registered within the regulatory body of their own nation state. So I can tell you I'm in the wonderfully weird position of being a qualified social worker, doing social work, but because I have not registered as a social worker in Scotland yet, because I have yet to move formally into that country, I'm just teaching from there remotely, I cannot call myself a social worker in Scotland. And I think, am I a social worker? Am I not a social worker? Oh, well, I always take comfort in my identity as a community development worker, because that's where I started from. So I can always take refuge in that, because currently, because in '86, social work and community work were separated from each other in the UK nationally wide, I can call myself a community worker and not feel guilty about, am I a social worker or not? Because I can just say I'm a community development worker, and that keeps me happy. So it is an issue for us to think about. That context is A, complex, B, no easy answers, and C, it's constantly changing. So therefore, I am very keen to argue that we are not going to be able to answer those questions, even if we had the time to discuss as long as we had originally in our presentation, because there are no easy answers. So we have to find our own solution to that. And for me, a key way of answering those questions is to get away from the binary. For me, it is not, is it international social work? Or is it local social work? For me, it's about the interaction between the two and the context within which we act. And since 2000, when I said that we needed to develop a theory and a practice of social work, I have developed my thinking to some extent, but not as far as I would like, to sort of say, well, actually, we do have the rudiments of some theoretical understanding of the links between the national, the local, and the international, because those 3 levels, or what used to be called the macro, meso, and micro levels, are interrelated, interactive, negotiated, and different. And they're different for each one of us. If I'm working in Scotland, I can tell you that what I do is quite different, because the legislation now is different than what I used to do when I was teaching at Durham University in England. So I am going to talk about international social work, not as is it this or that, but how it's contested territory. And I think it was Ines Denal who was saying in the chat that we really need to look for unity and diversity. And I was clapping for you, Ines, because I thought, yes, I've been saying that since 1998, saying we can only understand our situation if we understand that we are negotiating between what makes us unique as individual practitioners, to not use the term social work, not because I'm afraid of using it, but because I cannot use it because I'm actually sitting in Scotland today instead of England. I have to say I am a qualified social worker. I'm allowed to say that, but I can't say I am a social worker because I haven't registered in this country. But I'm still doing social work, even though my setting now is disasters. And for me, disasters has really opened my eyes in terms of the connections between problems, social problems that are experienced locally and their relationship with the international. And I prefer the term international to global because we are not a globalized profession. If by globalization, we mean the homogenization and the unifying of everybody and everything. That is not the case, except we are all engaged in economic and political structures that try to globalize us and remove our individual identities. But there's a lot of resistance to that. And I like to think I'm part of that resistance because I want to be an individual that's unique, but one that is linked up to the rest of humanity through our common shared objectives, which for me are about values on one level, but only on one level. And those values are about social justice and human rights. I like to think that historically, certainly, I was one of the key pioneers in bringing social justice and human rights into social work discourses. But it's still not finished, and there's still people who are arguing, even today as I speak. Social work has nothing to do with social rights and human justice. We just deliver services. That's all we do. And I think, yes, we do that, but we also do a lot more than that. And you need a framework within which to operate, because even if you think you're not acting politically with a small p or even with a big P, but most of us do not act politically with a big P or small p, which is about power relations. And we do have some power. So I say, well, okay, but actually you're operating within a context. And if you say, all I do is deliver services, you are taking for granted assumptions, which Tatsuru said, don't do that because you need to unpack them. And you do, because that assumption means that you're in what was called the maintenance mode by Martin Davis. And he argued very much that we had no right to question politics with a big P or a little p or power relations, because our job was just to do what the state told us. And of course, people like me objected to that. And that was the initial beginning of a huge discourse in the UK. And I was in England at the time, where we said, you know what, if you look at the social work profession, which I did, and I was always an evidence-based researcher because I'm a sociologist long before I became a social worker. And I thought, here is social work as a profession. Its identity is poorly described and articulated, but if you look at the stats, it is primarily made up of women. But if you look at the power structures within the profession, especially after 1970 in the UK, when it became big business and integrated into the local authority and moving out of the charitable organization, it was dominated by white middle-class men. And for young feminists like me at the time, this was really important because I thought, well, you know what? My boss in my department has a BA. I have a PhD. I've written 4 books. And I'm a lecturer. And it never occurred to me that I should even challenge that until I started talking to other feminists. And then I suddenly realized, hang on, there are issues of social justice here. And because we wanted to move away from charitable, oh, well, we'll be nice to you, Lena, because you're smart. We can see that you understand what's going on. So we'll let you into our meetings, which of course I was. But that wasn't the point, because I really resented paternalistic treatment and thought we need to have some entitlement to our rights. And that's where human rights and social justice came in. It came in because A, women were demanding that, and B, in the UK, but I know similar processes were happening in Canada and the US. Black people, the civil rights movement and the disability movement, we're all saying the same thing. And that's why social work had to respond. And then people like me were saying, well, we need a new theory and practice. And I did begin talking about feminist social work, anti-racist social work, anti-oppressive social work, globalization and social work, all of those things as a way to try and make sense of that lived reality where people like me who have an Italian, Canadian, British, English background and some Scottish too in the background, I think I'm not any one of these things. I'm all of these things. And I'm proud to be able to say, I am very fortunate. I have lots of identities that I associate with. And then, of course, the number of identities I associated with grew as I got older. But those tensions have never gone away. And it is really difficult to make sense of the interaction because they are holistic, they are intertwined, but we are always negotiating about this. And certainly in my time, since 2000, when I said we have to work on this a lot harder and more differently, and I looked to anti-oppressive practice as maybe a way of providing us with a basis in practice of looking at unity within diversity, because I knew, just like I didn't want to give up my many identities, neither did anyone else that I spoke to or did research with. And so therefore, I started looking at what other kinds of concepts besides the ones that are dominant in our society. And I have to say, as a Canadian Brit, I am more aware of the hegemony of American thinking in social work than I am of either British thinking or Canadian thinking or Italian thinking or Germanic thinking. And they're all different, I can tell you, having lived in the European continent now for all of my adult life, because I came over when I was very, very young. And I think it's really, really interesting because everybody thinks Western, and actually what they're talking about is American concepts, or at best Anglocentric concepts, because the other European traditions, and they are quite different, and I do speak several European languages, so I actually can engage with them in the languages themselves, are different, and the traditions are different, even though there were points of convergence, but also points of divergence within those points of interaction, because we only interact with each other at different points in time, except until the 1980s when globalization came along. And now I think globalization has forced us to come together and think differently. So I looked at other traditions, including religious traditions like Buddhism, Confucianism, Islam, but I lived in an Islamic country for 3 years when I was very young, and thought about all of those too, and saw both convergences, like where there were things that were similar. And for example, in Europe, I was shocked when I went to southern Italy, very different from northern Italy. They're still part of one country. But what I found was that the community work that I was doing in that country was very different from the community work I was doing in Algeria. But they had commonalities that I found really surprising when I looked into the back history of the place. Then I understood why. But there were words in the Calabrian language, as my mother used to call it, dialect, as my dad used to call it. I call it a language because I'm a linguistic scholar. And I saw mb and mp and all sorts of Arabic, because I was learning Arabic as well at the time, Arabic sounds in the Calabrian language. And I saw other commonalities, which were about the place of women in society. And even though women in Italy always kept their surnames, and I was really disappointed when I thought I was being a feminist in the UK and saying, I'm keeping my surname, maiden name, not my husband's surname. Thank you very much. He agreed to that. I agreed to that. That's why we were able to get married. But people found it really strange when we did that, because we were amongst the first to do it. Now everybody's doing it. But then my mom said, well, you're just following the Calabrian Italian tradition. And I thought, oh, no. I thought I was developing something new and different. So as Aristotle said, we keep recreating the same history over and over. But what I found was traditions around virginity for women and all sorts of other patriarchal relations. There was an overlap between what Islam said and what Calabrians and Italians in the north, because my father's from the north and my mother's actually Germanic in origins, but was brought up in Calabria. And I just thought, you know what? There's a lot more to this history than meets the eye. But my family, when I kept asking them about our origins, would not tell me. And I could see in the phenomenology of the family that there were many, many different ethnic groups there, because we had people with frizzy African hair, as I would call it, you know, the big afro cut. And I thought, oh no, when I gave birth to my child, first of all, he didn't have any hair, but it was very, very blonde. And then as it grew, it's a blonde afro. It's very, very frizzy. And I used to spend hours with my Black African friends saying, what do I need to do to tame his hair so that he can actually comb it? Because otherwise I'll be yanking it all out. And use their stuff, you know. So notions that cross cultures mean that we influence each other. So no culture is simply British or simply Japanese. We are a fusion, and we are very bad at understanding that fusion. But for me, I remember the concepts that we argued over when we were trying to work out how we could have global standards that allowed people the freedom to be themselves in their own locality, but to give us a language where we could speak together, even if it happened to have been English, because the Americans made it the dominant language through technology, which I am very grateful to them for, because it means that whereas I used to constantly having to learn languages and forgetting them as the minute I learned them, I found that now we are in the privileged, and it is a privileged position of getting translations. I was listening, you know, to the English translation in this, and I thought, I wish that our resources stretch to enable us to translate everything into Japanese when I'm speaking here in the UK, because we do have a few, not many, but a few Japanese speaking social workers, and more of them in Canada and the US, because there are larger communities of people with Japanese heritages that still hang on to their languages of origins, even though sometimes they've been in the country for generations, and therefore are just as much settled, whatever country it is, citizens of that country and denizens of that country, because some people choose not to become citizens of that country to make a statement about, we live here, we are settled here, this is our country, but we also have other attachments. And people like John Small have worked on that a lot. So I keep thinking, you know what, we are struggling for harmony, despite the kind of, and it's terrible here in Europe at the moment with the Russians and the Eastern European tensions around the expansionist agenda. So it is no longer true to talk about imperialism as being, this is my view, as being simply a Western issue. It is something that now is involving multiple polarities, and these will change, you know, just like England lost its imperial status, thank goodness. But, you know, the US and China and Russia and India's coming along doing the same thing, struggling for supremacy. And I think, why in the 21st century can we not, even in the countries that talk about harmony and social order, are we having all these tensions about who's dominant, who's not dominant, and why can we not get that discourse that people like me have been working on for 40 years to say, let us work together in harmony and try to resolve the international social problems that we have. And for me, it isn't just about the identity of our profession, although that is very important and crucial, and we do have to decide how we're going to have that unity within the diversity so that everyone has their full and equal place in the sun. but we also have to look at the broader context of internationalization and globalization and see how those impact on what I call the internationalization of social problems. And I will highlight two of them as we go through the presentation. One is poverty, which has been with us a long time, but it's getting worse rather than better. It had got better for a short period, both within countries and outside countries. Another one is climate change, and associated with that, although people don't think about that, but climate change has already produced wars and refugees. In parts of Central Asia, like Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, people are fighting over water. And who's going to have the water that is available? And can they continue to waste it like they did before, having leaky water supplies, infrastructures, and using millions of tons of water to irrigate cotton, which is very needy of water resources. And with drought, did you know that originally the Syrian civil war started off as a problem around drought? When people from southwest Syria moved into southeast Syria because they'd had several years of droughts, their crops were failing, so they moved to where they weren't. And the local people there, because there were about 1 million of them, didn't want them there because they didn't have enough resources. And because the political situation at the time wasn't interested in people moving within the country to solve their problems themselves, didn't facilitate a harmonious solution to the problems. They ended up fighting each other, and eventually it picked up with what was happening more widely in the Middle East and North Africa of the Arab Spring. And we have the Syrian refugee situation that we have, especially in Europe and Turkey. But that started off as a climate change issue. And the other thing, which is also related to climate change, is COVID-19, because people have lost respect as part of modernity. And I do blame the Brits for this, because they started off the Industrial Revolution and treated nature as a sink where it's cheaper for us just to dump everything into the atmosphere, into the rivers and into the soil than to actually capture that stuff. Now they knew, and I emphasize knew, that using fossil fuels would create problems of global warming further down the line. As early as 1856, when an American woman social scientist was poo-pooed for saying this, first one. Second one who said it was someone called John Tyndall in the UK at East Anglia University. And he presented this and he was applauded. And then everybody forgot about him. And then Sven Astrohumus, I don't know how to pronounce it in Swedish, but anyway, he also reiterated what the two people before him had said. And did anybody take any notice? Absolutely not, because the model of industrialization and consumption, production and consumption, were about using up resources in the cheapest way possible, paying people as little as they could get away with, because there was that move away from the rural areas where people were pretty much self-sufficient across Europe to being laborers for hire in the urban cities that started up and then were accompanied by slums and all sorts of degradation, both of the person and the environment. And that was when social work started here in the UK in the 1860s to deal with immigration, people who had immigrated to East London in search for jobs. And it was both internal migration and external migration. And a lot of the external migration was actually Eastern European Jews who were suffering from the programs in what was then called Russia. Later became the Soviet Union, and now is back to Russia. So we have complexity that we need to understand, both in forming our identity and understanding where we are today, because the past has influenced where we are today. And so that is about dealing with the tensions that we cannot deny are there, which is why I don't think an either or solution is going to answer our problems. We have to think of both that and the interaction between them, and how changing one tiny little bit in one area may mean big changes in another area. And climate change, again, is a good example of that, because the people in these small island developing nations, the SIDS as they're called, are suffering most from climate change. Places like Kiribati are sinking into the ocean. They've already tried to record on video their history and their culture because their island is sinking into the sea. And they had the courage to ask Australia for one of their uninhabited islands. And Australia said no, which I think is to the shame of Australia for doing that, because there are 40,000 people who need to get away from this island that has been theirs for centuries, not because of what they've contributed to climate change, because they're still living in more traditional ways. And so the West, and now increasingly, the first polluter is China, second, the US, third is India, and fourth is Russia. And then if you take the European nations, you have to globalize all of Europe together to get a large proportion. But otherwise, because they're still nation states, even though they're formally linked to the European Union, at least now 27 of the 42 or 45 states in Europe, I've forgotten which it is, are still kind of embedded in their own ethnic nationalist thinking. So, and that includes the UK, which is why we had Brexit, and people like me, and 48% of us that voted against it have no say in what's happening since then whatsoever. And I think, well, where are my human rights and my social justice issues to participate? So what we have, as far as I'm concerned, is that we have tendencies within globalization that try to assimilate everybody into one model. And then we have the counter tendencies of the resistance to that, that people are saying, no way, or over my dead body, some of us would say in the West. And I think that's to the advantage of social workers, because those processes are also reflected in social work, both at the micro level and at the meso and macro level, because in international social work, as described by basically the three sister organization of international social, the International Association of Schools of Social Work, IASSW, of which I was privileged enough to be president of for 8 years, and the International Federation of Social Workers, of which I'm a member through BASWA, the British Association of Social Workers, and the International Council for Social Welfare. All three of these got together because they were worried about issues of colonialism, because colonialism in 1928 was still rampant, and you still had then Britain as the dominant imperial power. You had attempts to use social work, and of course there's a long history of this, of social work oppressing people in other countries, particularly including in the West, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the US, the indigenous people of those nations, and also the Portuguese and the Spaniards oppressed the people in Latin America who were indigenous.
I'm sorry, I would like to let you know that the 10 minutes left for you.
Okay,
for you.
all right, thank you. So those led to appalling practices in residential schools where people were forced to assimilate and become Europeans. They didn't, thank goodness, but that was an example of social workers historically oppressing other people. So we have to really focus on those. And so the question I ask is, we've spent a lot of time in the last, well, I certainly have, in the last 20 years, particularly, trying to overcome this by acknowledging that history, but also trying to think differently about how we relate to each other and looking at those interrelationships and the tensions. But this is where the values of social work become really important, because egalitarianism is part of the social justice human rights agenda. And I do not accept that human rights are a Western invention. I'm sorry, when I read the traditional teachings of Buddhism, Confucianism, and Shintoism, they had notions of human rights. And like they were originally in the West, they were limited to the elite. And then through struggles and resistance, they became more and more generalized. But we're still fighting, you know, and I would say as a woman, I'm still fighting. You know, I was the first woman at Sheffield University in the social sciences faculty who was a professor. I think, you know, that was in 1989. And I think, why? After the, you know, the Equal Opportunities Act had been there since 1970, 19 years later, I'm still the only one? That's ridiculous. And even today, we make up the lower ranks of academia, but there's still a disproportionate few in the higher levels of academia here in the UK. I've already mentioned this, so I'm going to skip that one. But I'm really pleased that Indigenous people and people from within their own countries, their own local base and their national base have been resisting the kind of hegemonic situation in social work that came about, not because people set out, as they did earlier on in our history, to have hegemonic models. But I know that when you've got resources, and the reason why Americanism became the dominant mode in Europe was after the Second World War. Europe was devastated. Cities were demolished, including in the UK. And therefore, the Americans came in with the Marshall Plan. They provided money, which they loaned. It was a loan, not a gift. And we paid for it for 70 years, I think, in the UK for our part of the loan. But they also encouraged social workers to go and learn in the US. And of course, when you go to learn in another country, you're within that country milieu. So therefore, you will learn what is going on there. And then you will take a lot of those lessons, as I think Dr. Asano highlighted for us, back to your own country. And then you try to change them to kind of like make sense of them in your own context. So they're neither completely one thing nor completely another, which is why I don't like that either or. So, but we are using, and especially people like me, I thank the Indigenous people, whether they're the Maori people of New Zealand, the Aboriginals of Australia, the First Nations of Canada, or the Native Americans, because I have learned so much from them. And part of that was to be able to critique the model that we have of social work, which treated social institutions as the be all and end all of our interventions. Because I suddenly realized when I was practicing as a social worker in England, before I qualified even, that when I went into people's houses, poor people had appalling houses. They were houses that were not fit for human habitation. And I, along with a lot of community workers through the Federation of Community Workers, challenged the local state on that. We won. But I say we won the battle, but not the war. Because what did the state do? It was cleverer than us. So we used the law against them, won, and they were not allowed to use those unfit houses for people. Well, they just sent them out into the private sector. And what did the private sector do? Well, I can tell you, because my son is renting his accommodation as a student, and it is the worst accommodation you could possibly imagine. But because students are poor, relatively speaking, of course, they club together and share a premise together to be able to pay the bills and the rent. And their accommodation is atrocious. It violates every law, but unless you have a very skilled person who can negotiate with the landlord, you haven't got a hope of changing it. So we do need to have this anti-oppressive approach, which is rooted in human rights, social justice, throughout our concerns about social work. So what I argue in green social work particularly is that we need to include environmental justice as a fundamental, integral part of social justice, because I know from my research, and other people have documented it as well, that the poorest people who suffer the most from toxic environments, whether it's air, water, or soil, are the poorest people. And they're the ones who work in these places, but don't enjoy the benefits of being able to move out of those places to have a safe and healthy environment. And I'm just going to say green social work is a holistic approach that looks at both consumption and production patterns, argues against the current model, which treats the earth as a sink for rubbish, and insists that we have a duty to care for planet Earth as well as we have a duty to care for people. And until we take the two together and stop using the industrial model that was based on fossil fuel consumption and do it holistically and in solidarity with other people, we will not have true sustainability. We've got to challenge that model, and social workers have a key role in challenging that model. I've already mentioned this, so I'm not going to go into the specifics because I've said you can have these slides so you can read them for yourself. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one either because of the interests of time, but I want to focus on this last one, scientific translators, which is something that I developed because I work, and green social work does this, in a transdisciplinary way. And this means working with the physical scientists, sometimes to raise consciousness about the social, which they don't have a clue about, but also to give them confidence to say, you can come and talk to ordinary people. And if you talk to them about what they know, you actually might be able to learn a lot from them, as well as having them learn from you. And I will help you do the translation work so that you can communicate with them in non-jargonistic ways so that they can understand what you're saying. And there's a wonderful article written by Stuart Lane et al. In 2011 called Doing Flood Science Differently. And when he finally listened to people and did some of the things that I was saying, well, as a community worker, I would do this. He went and did that. And a town that flooded every year, Pickering in North Yorkshire in England, hasn't had a flood since then because he listened to the local people, and then together they created something new and different because he could see what was wrong with the local solution that they wanted, and they could see what was wrong with the solution that he originally proposed. So they came up with a new one. So I think we as social workers need to engage in co-production, listening to people. We know all this already. And then we will be able to produce this new kind of international social work, which I hope will draw on the green social work dimensions because it's transdisciplinary, it's involved in co-production, it has innovative dialogical communication between different groups of stakeholders, and it's research and evidence-based. But whereas if I were redrawing Tatsuru's very helpful, kind of like trying to get us to understand the relationship between local practice and international practice, I would put it in, this would be the international form, and this would be the local. And they're interactive and they're embedded within each other. But I put neoliberalism in our environment at the center of our international context, because that's what we're up against. The disregard of nature, the disregard of people even, I would argue, unless you're rich. So it's not accidental that since the 2007 crisis, neoliberalism has managed to increase the number of billionaires across the world. And now they're increasing in China and India and Russia and decreasing in the West. So I just leave it at that. And poverty, as we all know, has widened under COVID. So neoliberalism is important, and so is the physical environment and the social environment, all environments. But here I focus on the social environment, human rights and social justice, because that's our value base. But it is not enough to just focus on our values. Not enough. Why? because we have to tackle structural inequalities, which are rooted in the unequal distribution of power and resources. And those resources can be the right to clean air, clean water, clean soils, or it could be poverty, not getting paid enough for the work that you do. So I remember nickel and dimed in America, where people were working 70, 80 hours a week and still couldn't pay the rent. And then this is the new bit that green social work has included as part of that, which is tackling environmental degradation, mitigating disasters, because whether they're climate change or anything else, they're going to increase in intensity and frequency. So we have to enhance resilience. And I haven't got time to go into more detail on that because I must be in my last minute. So I'm going to conclude with saying very, very importantly, that if we're going to solve the tensions between the local, the meso, and the macro international level, we have to deal and draw upon the strengths that actually come from the local. And then we have to turn these local strengths into international strengths if we're going to work together to solve internationalized social problems like poverty and climate change. And we have a lot that we can contribute to that. So the first thing that is a strength, as far as I'm concerned, and it's that unity within diversity, is that we should celebrate diversity. And it's why I developed this concept of locality-specific, culturally relevant practice, because to me, that's what allows us to manage that tension between the local and the international. And we have to acknowledge that all our knowledges are contested. So when I listen to a First Nations person talking to me about what's going on in Canada, if I really listen actively to what they say instead of just hearing the words, then I realize that what they're saying is actually transformative in terms of what we have to do and how we have to do it and how we dialogue with others to do it. So it's dialogical, as somebody else was saying earlier on. And the other thing is to shape those interconnections that are already shaping us. But, you know, instead of just reacting to whatever the government says or some international NGO says, let's engage in a dialogue with them and say, okay, yeah, I understand where you're coming from, but listen to what the local people are saying about where they're coming from. We need something new and different if we're going to have those convergences and divergences. And divergences are really important in terms of gaining innovations within a co-produced, cooperative, collaborative framework. And that's why I think we as social workers do argue, and it's one of our strengths, for egalitarian partnerships and acknowledge the interdependence between us. So what happens in Japan can have very big implications for me in the UK and vice versa. So that's why I want those egalitarian partnerships that are rooted in localities, but actually go outwards as well as back down. So there's what I call an iterative loop between the local and the global, and keeps going round and round. And sometimes it expands, sometimes it gets smaller, but that's part of that dynamic change and interaction that we have to deal with. And then we do have to link our social institutions. It is not good enough as environmental social work and ecological social work argued until I came along. Now they're trying to take on board some of the things I've said. We have to look at that interdependence, interconnection between people, the animals, the plants, and the minerals, the physical environment that we live within, and care for all of that, as well as for people. And that's why I would say that it's still rudimentary and needs a lot more development. But I think green social work does allow us to articulate the connections between the local and the global in a new and innovative and hopefully transformative change way. And I am working on a chart that actually tries to capture that. So thank you very much for listening to me. And it's over to you, Joseph.
Dr. Dominelli, thank you very much. Thank you very much for an excellent presentation. I can hear a great applause, clapping hands from Philippines, from Indonesia, from Japan, from South Africa, from everywhere. So thank you very much again. And I'm still wondering how it was possible to share so many things, so many insights in just only 40 minutes. So thank you very much again